full confession, I'm keeping my eye on a junior hockey draft as we do this. So
I think we are just live, so give it a few seconds and I will give a start. All right. Well, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us here for our Minnesota State of the State broadcast. I have the privilege of introducing our guest today for this webinar, Blois Olson. Blois has been at the forefront of online political coverage and commentary for many years and has been a contributor for WCC Radio for, nearly 2 decades, I believe. He is a frequent guest on Morning News with Dave Lee, discussing political and public affairs with issues spanning from the local level, state level, all the way to the national level. Blois is also the founder and principal of Fluence Media, a consulting and content creation company with many familiar clients across the region. If you are not a subscriber of his Morning Take email updates, you absolutely should be. He provides email updates on Minnesota business news as well as Minnesota ag news. And starting this past March, Fluence Media started publishing updates on our neighbors to the east called Wisconsin Take. Blois, a Minnesota native, has also provided his analysis on a national level for places like CNN, MSNBC, NPR, the New York Times, Newsweek, amongst many others. And before I pass the reins on to Blois to begin his presentation, I wanted to add a quick personal story about my time working for Congressman Paulson in DC to kind of show you the weight that Blois's work carries across all Minnesota legislators. We were preparing topics for our weekly video for Eric, and he asked to look over our outline. And in typical Paulson fashion, he was being overly selective about what we had planned for him. And he finally got so frustrated with us, he said, listen, if it's not mentioned in Morning Take, I'm not talking about it on video. So that kind of goes to show you how much weight Blois carries with his messaging across Minnesota. And with that lengthy introduction, let me pass it on to our man of the hour, Blois Olson.
Thanks, Dan. I'm going to start clicking to share screens, but it's great to be with all of you. Thanks for joining. Hopefully we'll do this in person soon as well, because it would seem that the dialogue and the questions will be much better then. So just know that that's certainly in my mind as we do this. So I think you can all share my screen. One of the things that I have said for a number of years is that Minnesota has been one of the, if not the most volatile political state for several decades now. And 2020 is no different. And it was not going to be different before COVID and before civil unrest. And that is only added to the ability of and the dynamic of volatility that we will face going into the election. So take ourselves back. It might be a little hard to think about this, but take yourself back to life before COVID as you thought about 2020. President Trump was investing more than ever in Minnesota. He's had staff on the ground here longer than any Republican presidential candidate in my lifetime. There were going to be 3 to 5 nationally targeted U.S. House races. And redistricting, or all DFL control, was at stake in the Minnesota legislature. All 201 legislators are up. And with that, you could have the first time in 2 or 3 decades that one party controls the governor's office and both the House and the Senate during redistricting. That means that the usually bipartisan, court-driven process for redistricting is no longer necessarily going to happen in Minnesota, depending on the results of this election. And obviously, all the stakeholders feel that that's pretty much what the legislative race is really about this year. And now you add during 2020, COVID-19, racial tension and police reform, and then the dynamic of greater Minnesota versus the metro area, and really what the issues are there. And as we kind of walk through some of the maps here, you'll begin to kind of see that play out in many of these in many of these dynamics. But first, what do we know today? We know that in the couple polls that have been taken, that Trump versus Biden, Biden leads by 5 to 10 points in those polls. And when you look at job approval numbers of handling of COVID, we see that in the latest polls in Minnesota by Survey USA that Governor Walz has a 64% approval rating in handling COVID, and President Trump has a 34% approval in handling COVID. Now, COVID is not going to be the deciding factor, the handling of it, but it's certainly going to have a strong dynamic. And that's the best snapshot we have on comparing the approval ratings of either candidate right now. So if you go back to 2008 and you start to look at county by county presidential trends, you can see that Barack Obama in the first race did very well across the state, won counties across the state, and not just in the metro area and in the Iron Range, the upper right-hand corner of the arrowhead. Then in 2012, you saw that Republicans started to pick up more seats, more counties than they had won in 2008. And so Mitt Romney did better than John McCain in Minnesota by county in 2012. And then you fast forward to 2016, where President Trump came closer than any Republican has in my lifetime of defeating Hillary Clinton here in Minnesota. And you see that it was only a handful of counties and regions that Hillary Clinton did win, largely around the metro area. That one blue dot in the southeastern corner is Olmsted County, the home to Rochester. And then you have the Arrowhead, the Iron Range, and Duluth. So the dynamics of presidential politics has started to mirror the rest of the state, from a metro area being much more Democratic and the rural areas being more Republican. And then we look at the state Senate races between 2012 and 2016, and you see here where Democrats did much better in 2012 than they did in 2016 when they lost control of the Minnesota Senate. And you see that the vast majority of the seats that the Senate picked up were in greater Minnesota. They've since picked up one more seat in greater Minnesota as well. Similar for the Minnesota House, between 2014 and 2016, presidential year of 2016, you see that what Trump meant to them in greater Minnesota as well. And then you start to see how that 2016 piece started to shrink their margin in the metro area. One of the big questions for us all to watch this year, and the dynamics of it related to mail-in balloting, is turnout. So presidential turnout is always higher. And here you can see where the turnout was higher in 2016 in rural areas of Minnesota. It was also higher in urban areas, but it was that margin in urban area or in rural areas that gave President Trump his narrowing of the margin. And you compare these two maps, they're not completely comparable, because you'll see that some of the counties got over 80% turnout, where they had only previously gotten over 75%. So just be aware of that as you're looking at it. And we'll make these slides available after the webinar for you as well. But ultimately, the truth of the matter is that Minnesotans are moody when it comes to their politics. And that might not be the most popular word these days, because we're all a little moody. But when it comes to election day, I've always said that you can't predict a Minnesota election for more than 10 days out. And so there's no predictions today, but the mood of Minnesota is always changing. And so we'll have a quick history lesson here about how moody we've been since 1990, or over the last 30 years. In 1990, we elected Paul Wellstone and Republican Arnie Carlson on the same day, and Republicans in the House picked up 2 seats. In 1992, we voted for Bill Clinton, and the DFL picked up 9 seats. In 1994, Minnesota elected Rod Grams as a senator, and the Republicans picked up 16 seats. Just 2 years later, we voted for Bill Clinton, Paul Wellstone, and Republicans picked up 1 seat, all in the Minnesota House. Then in 1998, we did that. Republicans picked up 7 seats in the Minnesota House, and we voted for Jesse Ventura. In 2000, we elected Mark Dayton to the U.S. Senate. The Democrats picked up 2 legislative House seats, and Al Gore was voted on. And then in 2002, this is the year of the Wellstone plane crash, 10 days before the election. Minnesotans voted for Norm Coleman, Tim Pawlenty, and Republicans picked up 12 seats. 2 years later, Democrats picked up 13 seats in the Minnesota House, and we voted for John Kerry. 2006, we voted for Amy Klobuchar and Tim Pawlenty on the same day, but Democrats picked up 19 seats in the Minnesota House. 2008, Barack Obama overwhelmingly won the state, but Democrats only picked up 2 seats. 2010, Mark Dayton won in a recount, but Republicans picked up more seats in the legislature than they had in any one single election since Minnesota was a state. In 2012, Amy Klobuchar won re-election again, and Democrats flipped the majorities once again. In 2014, Republicans flipped the majority back in the House. If you're getting whiplash right now, just think how voters and analysts have felt for many years. But Mark Dayton won a strong re-election. In 2016, Republicans picked up seats as a result, and of course, Hillary Clinton barely won the state. And then in 2018, Tim Walz won re-election, and the DFLers picked up 13 seats in the House. So I like to say that politics in Minnesota is kind of like the weather. There's a chance of sunshine. It could be cloudy, unseasonably hot, freezing, chance of wind, or stuff from the sky that doesn't even have a name yet. Because really anything in Minnesota can happen. But there's a different dynamic that's beginning to emerge since 2016 that's very clear. And Democrats have made this publicly known. That is that they do not need to run a statewide campaign any longer. That the population shift to a metro strong population has meant that they can focus on metro area, suburbs, and a couple outstate areas, Rochester, Duluth, etc. And so from a county basis, Tim Walz had 400,000 more votes than Mark Dayton, but he won fewer counties. He won 21 of 87 counties. Meanwhile, Senator Klobuchar won with 60.3, but she only won 48 counties. Obviously the top Democratic vote getter. Senator Smith won only 20 counties, but she got 53% of the vote. And Attorney General Ellison got only a plurality of the vote and only won 14 counties, but he won the election. And so Democrats have really invested heavily in the 5th, the 4th congressional districts. And then in 2018, they did very well in the suburban districts of the 2nd, which is Southeast Metro, and the 3rd, which is the West Metro. And so you start to see how Democrats really are focused on urban areas, which brings us to 2018 voter turnout. You'll see here that voter turnout versus the presidential race in 2018 began to drop. It didn't increase anywhere, but Democrats were able to neutralize it in the metro area as well as some other key counties. And so as we watch turnout this year, and we keep in mind mail-in balloting, older voters who may be uncomfortable going to the poll, the number of poll workers and volunteers in heavily trafficked precincts, which Minnesota with a high turnout could be the fact that we have a shortage of poll workers throughout the state. And if that means polling places have to consolidate, we may have long lines and waiting. Minnesota does have excuse-free absentee balloting, and so there is a sense that there will be more turnout. In fact, to date, for the primary, which is August 11th in Minnesota, there's been about 20 times as many requests for mail-in ballots as the previous 2 cycles. So we do know mail-in balloting will be a factor. But then you start to look at how Tim Walz beat Jeff Johnson, and you start to see that his concentration is really the metro area, a few select counties throughout the state, and then tribal lands and tribal reservations. And then you look in the metro area and you start to see the intensity of the Democratic margin. This map represents the margin. And so when you start to have a doubling up or 100% margin over your opponent, you really start to see the way in which Democrats can pick up votes in the highly populous areas. And then you start to look at Mark Dayton in 2018 versus, or Mark Dayton in 2014 versus Tim Walz in 2018. And you see where Tim Walz outperformed Mark Dayton in metro areas, and Tim Walz underperformed Mark Dayton in greater Minnesota, even though Tim Walz was from greater Minnesota. His core counties were those of Blue Earth, Nicollet, Olmsted, and Winona, where there is a strong Democratic base, but also those are his home counties. And then you look versus 2010, when Dayton won barely, you see that Walz's performance intensified further in those counties. So again, Tim Walz got more votes than Mark Dayton, but he did it from fewer counties. And that is really the story of the state of Minnesota right now. Is the DFL turnout machine has proven to be growing and growing, which has been challenging for Republicans to win statewide. Then you start to look at the margin in Minnesota legislative races, and you start to see that the intensity of the Republican vote is much stronger in greater Minnesota. And again, that's where they are going to need to get people to the polls for President Trump if they want him to win Minnesota. But they're also going to have to look at the metro area, where again, the intensity in 2018 for Democrats was big. And if you look at all those asterisks, that's a flipped seat. So that indicates that those seats went from a Republican to a Democrat. And you can see there, here is where the majority of the 13 seats that Democrat picked up was in the metro area, in the suburbs. Similar for Amy Klobuchar, although you can see here where Klobuchar does very well. Versus her previous race, though, you can see she didn't do as well in rural areas, even though some would argue she had a weaker opponent. And then you look at the difference between Housley and Smith, and you see that even though Klobuchar did well in greater Minnesota, Tina Smith didn't do as well in greater Minnesota. And then you look at the US House. So last cycle, Minnesota had multiple open seats and multiple competitive seats. So you take the first district, the lower part of the state that looks orange, that was Tim Walz's old congressional seat. Jim Hagedorn wins that barely by less than 10 points. That'll be a top 10 to 15 race this year. You take the seat just above it with the asterisk, that's the seat that Angie Craig won from Jason Lewis. You see that she, again, didn't have a great performance, but she won significantly. You go up to the Northeast where Pete Stauber won the open seat. There, he did it with much more solid numbers. And then the 5th district had a change and a higher Democratic turnout, or the 3rd district is the teal one with the asterisk. That's where Dean Phillips won the open Paulson seat. And you see that that Phillips won big in that seat with over 10% Democratic increase in the vote. And so you look at how things changed between 2012, the last time we had redistricting, in 2018, and you start to see how redistricting matters in a big way because of where Democratic votes have increased, especially in congressional districts. They're even increasing themselves, but mostly it's in that western suburban district. And then you look at congressional seats as well. And this is a precinct by precinct map, so that you can see that Democrats do win some precincts. They just don't win them in a big way. And obviously the left side of the state there, the western side of the state, is Colin Peterson. Most people think that that's the #1 pickup opportunity for Republicans in the country. It'll be very expensive. Republicans have a primary there, but it's expected that Michelle Fischbach will win that primary, and she'll face off against Colin Peterson in the general. So district by district, you can see here Jim Hagedorn's strong, but he only won by just a sliver of the votes. Angie Craig, you can see that she wins all the suburban, but loses all the more rural counties. That little blue blip is Northfield for those of you playing along at home. The 3rd congressional district you can see here, the closer you are to the city, the more intense the DFL vote was. So from a city by city situation or a precinct by precinct situation, you know, the more populous precincts went for Phillips, and the less populous precincts went for the Republican. And then the 7th congressional district, you can see that Peterson has strong support across the district, largely agricultural district. He's been there for a long time. He's still probably going to be pretty tough to beat this year. And then in the 8th, you can see where Pete Stauber did very well against Joe Radinovich. And you start to see the strength of the DFL starting to wane even up in the Iron Range in this race. So that brings us to what are we looking at now? And based on previous results, COVID-19 starts to play in a few different areas. Schools is going to be one of them. If you think about COVID-19 and how the social psychology has started to play out, you know, the going line is that schools are the new mask. Everybody has an opinion and they're going to let you hear about it. And so if you think about schools reopen after Labor Day, however they reopen, voters are going to be very emotional about COVID-19 in schools. They're either going to think that the education isn't good enough, that their kids aren't safe enough, that we're not doing enough on distance learning. Schools is going to be the probably #1 most volatile issue, especially amongst suburban voters. These are people who traditionally vote on quality of education anyways. They expect high quality of education in Minnesota from suburban districts. And they are the bellwether of whether or not the state's going to stay Democratic in the suburbs or if Republicans would flip. The second big COVID issue is going to be the economy. Job losses, foreclosures, the stock market. Again, this is going to be a very personal issue. COVID-19 is going to be a very personal issue in the way people vote on it. It's going to be emotional. They're going to have feelings. And it's going to be how it's impacted their personal life. And then ultimately, there's idea of government control and masks will also play in. Do they think the governor's gone too far? Do they think the president hasn't done enough? Where are we at on testing? All of those pieces and the government's management are going to be the COVID mentality as I think of the voter going into it. I do believe that that will be the dominant issue on people's minds in November. The secondary issue, especially in Minnesota, but also across the country, is going to be racial tension and police reform. Just last night, the legislature, both the House and the Senate, passed some police reform measures. The governor's expected to sign it today or tomorrow. That lets a lot of pressure out of the pipe for both Democrats and Republicans that they can look at deeper reform kind of going forward in the next session. And they can kind of take the package that was passed last night, each side can run on it, and they can let the cards fall where they will. That does not eliminate racial tension or tension around racial issues. And this is one of those issues that lines up very much along party lines. And so if people were passionate about one side or the other before, this is only increasing their passion. It also starts to play out in Minneapolis versus the suburbs versus greater Minnesota. Your position may change depending on where you live, but the one thing that's probably certainly changed is your opinion about Minneapolis. If you are more progressive and really concerned about the Minneapolis police force and how they've treated Black people, you're going to be more passionate in the suburbs about your Democratic votes. And if that's less of an issue, you're going to be less passionate coming into it. So you start to think about the intensity of the voter towards Trump, Biden, and then how that plays out versus the legislative races. And what are those national implications? This isn't the first time that a potential issue in Minnesota plays out nationally. And the idea of, quote, defunding, dismantling, whatever words are used by both sides, that will become one of the issues that we watch very closely. And how does that play out between greater Minnesota? It's the Trump, defund police, the perception of crime in the big city, and what are, quote, Democrats doing to deal with those things. There will no doubt be a national effort to link Democrats to defunding or dismantling or rebuilding efforts in Minneapolis. And there will also be an effort to link Trump to, police brutality and white supremacy. Those will play along the margins. They won't be probably big mainstream issues. And then finally, the ag economy, which I know is important to many of you, is going to be a bellwether with voters in greater Minnesota. And I want us to just think about this from 2016 to 2018 to 2020. The ag economy hasn't gotten better in that time, as long as Trump has been president. And there's been a lot of volatility around that, from trade deals to immigration, now COVID. You start to see that even if there is 1 to 5 slippage points amongst the farm vote against the president, that means Minnesota would likely become out of reach for President Trump. And it seems to me that there is some slippage amongst farm votes with the president based on the lack of stability and clear vision that's been provided, whether it's USMCA, whether it's China, whether it's ethanol waivers and fuel waivers. There's just been a series of moves by the administration that may have farmers saying, you know what, there's many things I agree with the president about, but I need stability for the farm. And ultimately, I think stability is probably the thing that people are going to be looking for when they go to the ballot box. Now, that's their own perception of stability, whether it's between Trump and Biden or Democrats and Republicans. But ultimately, with the instability in the economy and uncertainty that's been caused by COVID, you start to see where people might just want to say, I don't necessarily agree with Biden on a lot of stuff, but I'd just like to get back to some semblance of stability. And that's kind of the underlying theme that I think voters will be thinking about in November. And now let's remember it's July, so there's a lot of time there. But as we break down the state, the Minnesota House, Republicans need 8 seats to take back control. And in the Minnesota Senate, the DFL needs 4 seats to take back control. And there's 12 to 30 seats in play across the House and the Senate. So it's very possible for both the GOP to take back the House, and it's very possible for the DFL to take back the Senate. So where are those seats? So urban seats are not in play, but they are critical to statewide results. So if you're Tina Smith or you're the Biden campaign in Minnesota, you have to make sure the turnout in urban areas is in line with 2016 numbers and try to outpace 2016 and 2018 numbers, because they will matter in statewide races. Now you look at the suburbs. There's 7 to 8 Senate seats in play. There's 13 to 16 Minnesota House seats in play in the suburbs. That alone could mean the majority for either side. So if Democrats were able to, if the trend leans blue and Democrats pick up, 4 or more Senate seats, odds are they would then increase their margin or hold their margin in the Minnesota House. Now, if Republicans were able to hold and or win some of those 7 to 8 Senate seats, that would mean that Democrats would likely lose a few seats that would put them closer to being in the minority. And then that's where we pivot to rural Minnesota, which will be critical for Republicans to turn out voters to build a margin statewide if they are to do so. And it's critical for Republicans to hold, because there are 2 to 4, that's supposed to be Senate, not Senar, seats in play, and 3 to 7 House seats. But most of those seats are Democrats who would be vulnerable. Whereas the suburban seats split about 50-50, the rural seats are more vulnerable Democrats. So if there is a rural wave for Republicans and they're able to pick those up, then it becomes much more challenging for Democrats to pick up the Minnesota Senate, or there's a potential that they could lose the Minnesota House. So that's how you look at it. So what are the make or break voting blocks? I will say that agriculture voters are a make or break voting block for Trump, especially in Minnesota. Any slippage is going to be bad for him, and that margin will matter in down ballot races. The big question is, Trump did fairly well in the suburbs for a Republican in Minnesota during 2016. Can he possibly match that number? I think that's really tough to see. I don't know about you, but as I've traveled, people are very polarized on this issue, but people who are leaving Trump, or people who are changing their minds, are more likely to be leaving Trump than leaving Biden at this point. And then the big question nationally and in Minnesota is, can Democrats turn out millennials? They have a ton of passion around racial justice. They become the largest voting bloc, but we know young voters traditionally don't turn out. And how will that play out nationally? And ultimately, in Minnesota, I think will have a strong system for absentee or mail-in voting. But how will that play out across the country, and how will Minnesota compare? If Minnesota is, better than average, like we think we always are, then I think people will feel good about the results in Minnesota. But I think there's a lot of states where the voting by mail, the lack of turnout, maybe because of COVID or public health concerns, could have an impact. And those are the things, if you're kind of following closely wherever you're sitting, Minnesota, Wisconsin, or somewhere else in the country, or you just like to watch other states, that's there. Think about California. California's had a huge lockdown. California is probably never going to be in play for Biden and Trump, but that could change the dynamics. And now you start to add states that could be in play, like Nevada and Florida, and maybe even Arizona. And if people have challenges getting out to vote there because of COVID, or getting, maybe they have to wait in line for 8 or 9 hours or 6 hours, which is not unheard of in other states, that could really impact that. And how will that look at the national race? For those of you who will play the Electoral College game on CNN or another site to try to figure out somebody's path. But as you can see, there is definitely volatility ahead in Minnesota. It's like the weather. We don't necessarily know what's going to come down from the sky, and anything's possible. I will stand for questions, but just a little plug. If you're interested in signing up for any of our newsletters, if you just go to fluence-newsletters.com, you can see it there. And now I'm ready and open to answer any questions.
All right, folks, and you can ask questions through the Q&A portion of the Zoom webinar portion at the bottom of your screen. So feel free to place a question in there, and we'll move it to Blois. And while we're waiting, I do just want to thank Blois for joining us to help add some value during these difficult times. Obviously, Zoom is kind of the wave of 2020. So we do appreciate your time, and thank you so much for joining us to help fill in our members on this important topic. Don't be afraid all to ask questions at once.
Oh, somebody's got a hand up. Looks like Gary. Go ahead, Gary. Oh. Gary, can you unmute your mic? There you go.
Did you get my question?
No, go ahead. Try it again.
Why do you think there's such a difference in ideology between metro areas and non-metro areas?
You know, I think nationally we have seen, and we're starting to see it in Minnesota play out based on the lifestyle that you desire. And I say that knowing that the folks I talk to in greater Minnesota or in rural areas across the country, and I've traveled to Iowa and South Dakota and Nebraska and Wisconsin this year, there is just a different way of life in rural areas. And it doesn't even have to be that rural. And so even, I'll just take New Richmond, Wisconsin, for example. It's basically a suburb of the Twin Cities by now, in some ways, but people want land and they just don't want, they have a different attitude about government interference or perceived interference in their life. On the flip side, I think that, you know, in the cities, you've started to see a major youth movement of younger people living in cities. They have different feelings about public safety. They have different feelings about what to expect. And some of them, like for instance, in Minneapolis, they've moved from places like Chicago and New York. And so things that people in Minneapolis have traditionally thought were vital, they're like, well, no, it's a big city, you're gonna have a little more crime. And so it really is what your expectation of lifestyle and comfort is. And then I think it's been exacerbated by national politics. I think it goes back to probably 2 or 3 presidential cycles where there was this dynamic of, you know, the big city liberals versus the conservatives and things like that. But it also, you know, let's also call it out. Rural areas have stayed more white and urban areas have become more diverse. And that has changed the way in which not just, and just to kind of to diagnose that a little more, is not just like Democrat versus Republican, but you have Democrats that are, you know, Bernie Sanders Democrats versus Joe Biden Democrats. And that's a pretty big gap on issues like free college for all, or cancel the rent, or single payer healthcare. And I just ultimately think that that's become where the division lines up.
You know, it just seems to me, though, that this violence, where does it come from? Does it come from a lack of hope?
Well, you know, I haven't done a ton of research on that, and we haven't seen a lot of polling about it. But I think there's a lack of hope. There's there's some economic, obviously major economic strife and some challenges there. But there is something called the Ferguson effect, where there's a sense, it's back to the whole mob mentality. It's much easier for me to turn over a car if everybody else is doing it. And that seems to be one of the dynamics we're seeing play out in urban areas right now.
Yeah, thanks.
Yep.
And it looks like we do have one question in the Q&A from Stacy Fuji. Campaigning is different this year due to COVID, no parades, not as much door knocking, et cetera. Does that favor incumbents or challengers, Democrats or Republicans?
Great question, Stacy. I actually do think it favors incumbents. They have better name ID. I know that legislative candidates have been trying to do some socially distanced door knocking. I know that getting volunteers on campaigns has been harder. So I do think that the ground game will look very different, and that usually favors Democrats. They usually have more feet on the ground, door knocking, et cetera. So I think that it will favor incumbents just because of name ID. But I also think that Democrats could suffer because, you know, those last 3 days of their get out the vote could be impacted as well.
All right, and while we're waiting for the next question, I do want to make everyone aware of our upcoming Cooperative Network webinar on August 4th. The topic will be a market update on the ag economy right here on Zoom. Feel free to send any more questions through the Q&A or pop on to ask it live. Blois, again, thank you for your time. We do appreciate it, and I know our members appreciate your time as well.
It's always because I say that I won't make predictions that people don't ask questions. Sorry. 10 days out, I will.
All right, folks. Well, with no more questions on, I do want to thank Blois for joining us here today. Thank you for joining Cooperative Network and our members to help provide this important update over the summer. Obviously, as you mentioned, things do change as we move closer to November. Anything could happen in these pandemic days, but it is important to get a screenshot of the reality as it sits right now. So thank you again, Blois, and thank you for joining Cooperative Network for this State of the State webinar.
Thank you, guys. Have a great day.